Woman wanted for the murder of a Houston area professional bull rider has been arrested in Fort Bend County. Law enforcement took 22-year-old LaShawn Denise Bagley into custody on January 3rd on a murder warrant after she left Utah during the investigation into the shooting death of 27-year-old Demetrius Allen, better known as Ouncie Mitchell.
Keith, Salt Lake City police arresting LaShawn Denise Bagley shortly after the incident back in September, but they released her while they continued their investigation. That's when she left Utah.
Salt Lake City police said Bagley was initially arrested after the incident, but was released while detectives continued to investigate. And that's when she left Salt Lake City. She was arrested in Fort Bend County on a fugitive warrant January 3rd. The family feeling closer to justice as they come to terms with life without Ouncie.
It was just past midnight on September 12, 2022, when the piercing crack of gunfire shattered the silence of a quiet Salt Lake City neighborhood. The sound echoed through the night, violent and unforgiving, drawing neighbors to their windows in fear. Inside a modest apartment, a man lay crumpled near a glass sliding door, his body riddled with the consequences of betrayal and rage. Blood pooled against the cool tile floor, its deep red reflecting the broken shards of glass scattered across the room. Outside, the faint hum of city life continued, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding in the shadows of this quiet street. When officers arrived, they were greeted by chaos. The shattered door stood as the only witness to what had just occurred, a sudden eruption of violence that ended a life in seconds. The victim, later identified as Demetrius Allen, known to the rodeo world as Ouncie Mitchell, was rushed to the hospital. But within moments of arrival, the declaration came that no one wanted to hear. He was gone. A man who had spent his life facing down 1,000-pound bulls in arenas across the country had been taken not in the dust of a rodeo ring, but in the supposed safety of someone's home. The question was immediate and chilling. How could a promising 27-year-old bull rider, a father, a competitor, a man with dreams that stretched far beyond the arena, find himself the target of such brutal violence? And more disturbingly, why was the finger of blame pointing not toward a stranger, not toward some unknown intruder, but toward someone he knew intimately? Someone who had once shared his trust, his laughter, and his love. As investigators worked through the night, piecing together the shattered fragments of this crime scene, the truth began to crawl into focus. This was not a random act. It was a domestic tragedy, one seated in jealousy, control, and a volatile relationship that had spiraled far beyond repair. What emerged from the evidence was the story of a man who lived courageously in the spotlight, but whose private battles would ultimately lead to his death. This is not just the story of a murder. It is the story of red flags ignored, of love turned toxic, and of a life extinguished before it could fully bloom. It is the story of how a celebrated bull rider, known for his grit and resilience, found himself face to face with a threat he could not outrun. And as we step into the shadows of his final hours, the question lingers: how does love turn lethal? And how can we recognize the breaking point before it's too late?
Because he's a nice person.
Laquita Allen is his mother, still trying to process the loss of her only son.
This tragedy is very unexpected. We expected him to die by the bull, not by the bullets.
Police in Salt Lake City say Ouncie was shot and killed early Monday morning at this apartment complex where he'd been staying with a female friend while in town for the Utah State Fair. Apparently, Ouncie came to collect his things after a dispute when she's accused of shooting him.
I really don't know the details. I don't want to know the details. My only thing is getting my son home.
Before his name became a headline and his story another entry in the dark archive of true crime, Demetrius Allen was a boy from Houston with a restless spirit and a fire in his chest. To those who knew him, he was not just a son, a brother, and a father. He was a dreamer, a man willing to throw his body into the jaws of danger in pursuit of glory. Rodeo was not just a sport to him, it was a calling. The world knew him as Ouncie Mitchell, a nickname passed down from family, a title that carried with it both affection and respect. In the brutal, unforgiving world of bull riding, Ouncie was more than just a competitor. He was a rising star. He rode with fearlessness, his small frame clinging to massive beasts that could crush him in an instant. He wore that courage like a badge, and it carried him into the ranks of the professional bull riders circuit. By the fall of 2022, he was ranked 157th in the world. Not the very top, but enough to tell anyone watching that he was on the path upward. For every young cowboy, there is the dream of standing beneath bright arena lights, hearing the roar of the crowd after conquering a bull that had defeated dozens before. Demetrius was living that dream, one ride at a time. But rodeo wasn't just about him. Back in Texas, he had a little girl, his daughter, who was the anchor in his chaotic, travel-heavy life. Friends said that no matter how dangerous the sport, no matter how many miles away he was, she was the reason he kept going. He wanted her to see him not just as a competitor, but as a man who never gave up. In her eyes, he wanted to be a hero. Yet behind the image of grit and success was another story, a complicated relationship that would prove to be his undoing. Demetrius was involved with a 21-year-old woman named LaShawn Denise Bagley. Their relationship was anything but stable. It was the kind that burned bright and fast. Passion and jealousy tangled together until love became indistinguishable from conflict. Those who knew them described it as on and off, a bond that seemed to draw them together but tear them apart in equal measure. Bagley was young, fiery, and in many ways unpredictable. In Demetrius, she found someone older, someone admired in his world, someone who could command a crowd. But with admiration came tension. Arguments flared easily. Trust wavered. Control became a constant shadow over their time together. When Demetrius traveled to Salt Lake City in September 2022 for the Utah State Fair Rodeo, he wasn't just competing. He was also planning to stay with LaShawn. It seemed like a chance to reconnect, to settle the storms that so often followed them. To the outside world, it looked like another rodeo trip, another chance to prove himself. To those closer, it was also another chapter in a fragile romance that had already shown too many cracks. In the hours before his death, friends recalled him as upbeat, determined, ready to ride. Yet beneath that determination was something quieter, the weight of a relationship that no longer offered safety. He was stepping into the arena once more, but this time, it wasn't bulls he had to worry about. It was the company he was keeping and the fragile line between love and danger that he could not seem to escape. Long before the night of September 12th, the story of Demetrius Allen and LaShawn Bagley had been unraveling in whispers and warning signs. To the outside world, they might have looked like just another young couple trying to find their way, but to those who saw closer, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Their love had never been steady. It had always carried the sharp edges of volatility. It was the kind of relationship where laughter could turn to shouting in an instant, and where devotion was constantly interrupted by suspicion. Friends of Demetrius would later recall moments when his phone buzzed with angry texts, messages that swung from affection to accusation within the span of a few lines. LaShawn, just 21, was fiercely protective of their bond, sometimes to the point of obsession. Demetrius, on the other hand, lived a life that was constantly on the move, different cities, different arenas, different crowds. For someone already uncertain, his lifestyle was like fuel to a fire. Arguments became routine. Jealousy became a constant visitor. Some described LaShawn as struggling with control, desperate to hold on to Demetrius even as the reality of his career kept pulling him away. Others said Demetrius himself was not blind to the chaos, that he sometimes talked about the strain, about how the relationship could be suffocating. But like so many caught in the cycle, he stayed. Whether it was hope, love, or simply the belief that things could get better, he returned to her again and again. There were whispers of heated confrontations. Friends noticed changes in Demetrius's demeanor when she was around, subtle but telling. The way he carried tension in his shoulders, the hesitation before he spoke her name. The rodeo world demands courage, but courage does not always translate when it comes to matters of the heart. In the ring, he could anticipate the moves of a bull, the violent twist of muscle and horn. But in love, unpredictability had a different face. As the summer of 2022 gave way to fall, the couple's clashes seemed only to escalate. Their relationship was defined by cycles of reconciliation and conflict, a pendulum that never stopped swinging. And when Demetrius told friends he would be staying with LaShawn during his trip to Utah, some were unsettled. They had seen the storm clouds gathering before. But in his world, rodeo came first, and perhaps the hope of patching things up seemed worth the risk. There's a cruel irony in how warning signs often appear so clearly in hindsight. The sharp words, the threats hidden in arguments, the nights spent apart only to return again. They all formed a pattern, a trail of red flags waving furiously in the wind. But in the moment, it is easy to dismiss them as normal struggles, the turbulence of young love. For Demetrius Allen, ignoring those warnings meant stepping into a space where danger was already waiting. And as that September night approached, the tension between them was not cooling. It was simmering, building, reaching for a boiling point. It would not take much, a word, a suspicion, a confrontation, to tip it into something irreversible. The stage was already set, the red flags already raised. All that remained was for the storm to break. The night of September 11th, 2022, should have ended like so many rodeo nights before, with Demetrius Allen returning from the arena, his body sore, his mind alive with adrenaline, carrying the pride of having once again faced down danger in front of a cheering crowd. He had come to Salt Lake City for the Utah State Fair rodeo, but when the dust of competition settled, he wasn't heading to a hotel or a teammate's place. He was heading back to the apartment of 21-year-old LaShawn Bagley, the woman whose presence in his life had become both comfort and chaos. Witnesses say the two had attended an event together that evening. There had been drinking, laughter, and the usual crowd of friends and acquaintances. But somewhere in the shadows of that night, an argument sparked. The details of what was said remain murky, but what is clear is that the tension between them had returned, sharp and cutting. By the time Demetrius went back to LaShawn's apartment to collect his belongings, the fragile thread holding their relationship together was already fraying. Inside the apartment, emotions boiled over. Words turned into confrontation, suspicion into fury. Demetrius was near the sliding glass door when the final explosion came, not with fists, not with more words, but with the deafening sound of gunfire. Several rounds ripped through the air, shattering the glass, tearing into the night, and into him. The impact was immediate and devastating. A man who had faced down bulls weighing 1,000 pounds was brought to his knees not by an animal, but by bullets fired at close range from someone he knew, someone he had once trusted. The glass door collapsed in a spray of shards, splintering across the floor. Demetrius fell, his body pressed against the wreckage of what seconds earlier had been a barrier between life and death. Neighbors, startled awake by the sound, rushed to their windows and doors. Some called 911, their voices urgent, panicked, describing the sound of multiple shots fired. When first responders arrived, the scene was chaos. Demetrius was still alive, barely clinging to breath, his body broken, the apartment silent except for the hum of city noise beyond the shattered doorway. Officers secured the area, and paramedics worked quickly to rush him to the hospital. But despite their efforts, despite the fight he had always carried inside him, his body could not withstand the injuries. Just after midnight, doctors pronounced him dead. In that moment, the life of a father, a son, a rider with dreams stretching far beyond the rodeo arena, was extinguished. The crime was as senseless as it was shocking. A young man who had risked his life professionally in sport had lost it in the most intimate and devastating of ways, at the hands of someone who had once claimed to love him. The crime scene told its own story, a shattered door, bullet casings scattered across the floor, and the heavy silence that follows sudden violence. And in that silence, investigators began to ask the questions that would shape the case. Why had LaShawn fired those shots? Was it anger, fear, or something darker? What could push a moment of conflict into irreversible tragedy? For now, only one fact was certain. The rodeo star known as Ouncie Mitchell was dead, and the woman who pulled the trigger was sitting in police custody, her life now entangled with his forever. In the moments after the gunfire faded, the apartment fell into a chilling quiet. Shattered glass glistened on the floor, bullet casings scattered like grim confessions, and the weight of what had just transpired settled heavy in the air. For officers arriving at the scene, the details were chaotic and incomplete. Witnesses had called in reports of shots fired, but no one could yet explain why a promising young bull rider was lying mortally wounded inside an apartment that was supposed to have been a place of rest. LaShawn Bagley was there when police arrived. According to reports, her story shifted as investigators pressed her with questions. At first, there was the insistence that the shooting had not been intentional. She claimed Demetrius had been trying to force his way into her apartment, that she felt threatened, that the gun was fired in self-defense. It was a narrative woven in the heat of panic, one that attempted to recast the final moments not as an execution of rage, but as a desperate act of survival. But the scene itself began to unravel her words. The shattered glass door bore the marks of bullets fired from inside out. Investigators noted how the trajectory of the rounds told a story of anger more than defense. If Demetrius had been outside, as she suggested, why were there signs of him being struck while already in the threshold of the home? Why did the physical evidence contradict her explanation? Detectives began piecing together the hours before the crime. Witnesses from the rodeo event reported arguments between the couple, disputes that carried the heat of jealousy and mistrust. Others recalled how Demetrius had spoken of simply going to collect his belongings, not to fight, not to confront. Yet when he arrived, he was met not with words, but with gunfire. Digital trails added weight to the suspicion. Text messages between the two painted a picture of turbulence. Arguments laced with anger, words that hinted at threats and control. The volatile push and pull of their relationship became clearer with each exchange. Police pored over phone records, reconstructing the communication in the final hours, each message pulling the curtain further back on the storm inside their relationship. LaShawn's demeanor also struck investigators. For some, her calmness after the incident seemed unnatural. For others, it reflected shock. But either way, her behavior would be scrutinized. She was taken into custody, facing charges of murder and felony discharge of a firearm. In the eyes of the law, the burden of proof was now on her shoulders. Could her actions be justified, or was this the cold result of a relationship built on volatility and obsession? The community was left stunned. News traveled quickly through the rodeo circuit. Ouncie Mitchell, the young cowboy with grit in his veins, was gone. And the person accused of pulling the trigger was not an unknown enemy or a rival, but the woman he had chosen to trust with his time and his heart. For investigators, the case seemed straightforward on paper. A young man, unarmed, shot multiple times, his belongings still inside the apartment he had only come to retrieve. But as with every story of love turned deadly, the truth would become tangled in perspective, emotion, and the complexity of human relationships. LaShawn's defense was already clear. She would argue fear. Fear of Demetrius. Fear of what he might do. But the physical evidence, the glass, the casings, the wounds, whispered another truth. And the task of untangling those whispers would soon move from investigators to the courtroom, where each side would try to make the narrative their own. The case of Demetrius Allen's death did not unfold in the courtroom like the straightforward tragedy many expected. From the moment LaShawn Bagley was taken into custody, prosecutors believed they had the evidence needed to prove murder. They pointed to the shattered glass door, the multiple shots fired, the pattern of conflict that had shadowed the couple for months. To them, it was a clear story of rage turned deadly. Bagley faced charges of murder and felony discharge of a firearm, accusations that could have placed her behind bars for decades. As the case moved forward, the rodeo community and Demetrius's family braced themselves, hoping justice would be found in the steady hand of the law. But the courtroom is not a place of certainty. It is a place where facts are weighed against perception, where stories are reshaped into arguments, and where the outcome can diverge sharply from what emotions demand. Her defense team argued fiercely that this was not an act of cold-blooded violence, but one of fear. They claimed that Demetrius had been trying to force his way into her apartment, that she believed she was in danger, and that the shots fired were not of malice but of survival. They painted her not as a killer, but as a young woman pushed to the edge in a relationship fraught with conflict. Prosecutors countered with evidence that suggested otherwise. They highlighted the ballistic trajectory, the shattered glass, the placement of Demetrius's body, details that, to them, spoke of aggression from inside the apartment outward, not of someone fending off an intruder. They emphasized the text messages, the volatile arguments, the spiraling pattern of a relationship that had become combustible. To them, this was not self-defense. It was execution. But in January of 2024, the case took a turn that left many stunned. After months of legal wrangling, prosecutors announced they would be dropping the charges against LaShawn Bagley. The conclusion was unsettling. Under Utah's interpretation of self-defense laws, the evidence did not meet the threshold to prove her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. To the shock of Demetrius's family and fans, the court declared that her actions, however tragic, were legally justified. The announcement rippled through the community. For some, it felt like a miscarriage of justice, a loophole that allowed someone responsible for firing multiple rounds into a young man's body to walk free. For others, it was a grim reminder of the complexity of domestic disputes, of how easily truth can become blurred in moments of high emotion and violence. No jury ever heard the case. No sentencing was handed down. Instead, the final word of the court was silence, a legal erasure of responsibility that left a family grieving without closure. Demetrius's loved ones were left to reconcile the brutal reality. The woman who ended his life would not spend years in prison. She would walk free, her name forever tied to his in the shadows of tragedy. Justice, it seemed, had been written not in absolutes, but in gray. And in that gray, the memory of Ouncie Mitchell became something larger than a case file. It became a haunting reminder of how fragile the line between love and violence truly is, and how, even in a courtroom, truth can be as slippery as the bulls he once rode. When the news spread that Demetrius Allen had been shot and killed, the rodeo world froze. It wasn't just that they had lost a competitor, they had lost a brother in the ring, a man who lived with courage etched into his every move. The shock rippled far beyond Salt Lake City, reaching Texas, where his family received the devastating call that no parent should ever have to endure. For his family, the tragedy was unbearable. They remembered him not as a headline, not as another victim in the growing tally of domestic violence, but as the boy with bright eyes and endless energy, the young man who laughed loudly and carried his daughter on his shoulders, the father who dreamed of giving her more than he had ever known. His daughter, still so young, would grow up with stories instead of memories, pictures instead of presents. She would never again hear his voice in person, never again feel the protective embrace of the man who had risked his life every day for sport, but always kept her as his reason for fighting. His friends within the bull riding circuit mourned openly. They spoke of his grit, his determination, and his kindness behind the scenes. He wasn't just another rider trying to climb the ranks. He was someone who lifted others, who smiled even through the bruises and the exhaustion, who carried hope for something better in his heart. Rodeo is a sport where every ride could be your last. But few imagined Demetrius would meet his end off the dirt, in the quiet of a living room, at the hands of someone he trusted. The rodeo community organized tributes in his honor. At events, his name was called, his memory acknowledged in the silence before the next rider climbed onto a bull. For competitors who knew him, it was a chilling reminder of how quickly life could be stolen. For fans, it was a bitter loss, the end of a story they had hoped would continue for years. But grief was not the only response. There was outrage too. Many struggled to understand how charges could be dropped, how the legal system could allow someone to fire multiple shots and then walk away without punishment. For his family, it was salt in a wound that had never begun to heal. They spoke out, questioning the fairness of a decision that seemed to value technicalities over accountability. Their anger wasn't just about losing Demetrius. It was about losing him without justice. In Houston, in the rodeo arenas, and across social media, his death sparked conversations about domestic violence, about how quickly arguments can turn fatal, about the unseen battles inside relationships that look ordinary from the outside. People who had never heard of Ouncie Mitchell before came to know his story, not for his victories in the ring, but for the tragedy that ended his life. For those closest to him, the grief was permanent. Every birthday for his daughter, every holiday without him, every empty seat at the family table was a reminder of what had been taken. They clung to memories, replaying his laughter, his words, the way he moved when he was doing what he loved. And yet, in every memory, there was the shadow of the night that took him away. The rodeo world carried on. Bulls bucked, crowds cheered, arenas filled with dust and adrenaline. But in the background, the echo of his name remained. Ouncie Mitchell had been one of their own, and his absence was felt in every ride. The life of Demetrius Ouncie Allen was not supposed to end like this. He had built his world on courage, on the ability to stare down danger and rise again, no matter how many times he was thrown to the ground. Yet the bull that finally bested him was not in an arena. It was not muscle or horn or dust. It was the chaos of a relationship spiraling out of control, the volatility of love when it turns to fear, the unpredictability of human emotion that can erupt with deadly force. His story is more than the headlines. It is more than the cold words of legal filings and court transcripts. It is a cautionary tale about the signs we ignore, the red flags that wave silently in the background, and the thin line between passion and destruction. Demetrius was a father, a son, a competitor, a man who carried both strength and vulnerability. And in the end, it was that vulnerability, his trust in someone who should have protected him, that became the doorway to his death. The justice system closed his case without punishment, leaving his family with a wound that time cannot heal and a verdict that feels like silence. They are left to grapple not just with his absence, but with the bitter truth that no courtroom will ever call what happened to him a crime. For them, the pain is permanent. For the community, the questions linger. What does it mean when love becomes lethal? How many more lives will be stolen in the shadows of relationships that look ordinary from the outside? And how do we measure justice when a man can be shot multiple times, yet no one is held accountable? As you sit with this story, ask yourself, where does accountability begin and where does it end? And in the lives around you, would you recognize the signs if love began to slip into danger? This was the story of Demetrius Ouncie Allen, a rider who braved bulls but could not escape the tragedy waiting behind closed doors. If you found this story haunting and important, don't let it fade into silence. Share it, discuss it, and help keep his name alive. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to Sinister Tales, and turn on notifications so you never miss the stories that the world tries to forget. Because sometimes the most dangerous battles aren't fought in the open. They're fought in the shadows of the people we love.